again, the School World Order. And in fact, I just had your book sitting here in front of me or beside me, and I just left it over there on the table. I'll have to slip off during the show and go grab it over there. But, we had a lot more. There you go. We had a lot more to cover from your book. And again, thanks for citing me in your book there. I appreciate the mention. Hello to everybody in the chat room tonight. Got a good show lined up, so thanks for joining up with us this evening. And so we just, we want to continue with our discussion on your book and your work and basically what is your exposure of the coming technocracy, I would say. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And trying to, the globalists attempt to standardize education, not for making smart people, but for making people good workers in future technological factories, in IT type stuff, whereas in the previous century it was the industrialist revolution. Now they want to focus on the technological revolution going into the future here and whatever else until they come up with the next revolution. So anyway, John, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on. How you doing?
Good. I'm doing pretty well. It's been a little bit chilly up here. It was like 30 degrees today, but nothing like the warm Southern California mountains in the middle of winter.
Okay. Yeah.
So let's see here. You go into the history of UC Santa Barbara in your book. In my own research, I kept coming across UC Santa Barbara as well, with lots of nefarious characters going in and out of there. What did you find regarding UC Santa Barbara?
Well, that's just kind of a case study of a series of what I'll call these public-private partnerships through what are called P20 councils. There's P20 councils. There's also P16 councils. And then sometimes they call them PK20 or PK16. So the P stands for preschool, K is kindergarten, and then up to age 20. Sometimes they put a plus over it. And so basically these are public-private partnerships at the state level, which integrate networks of schools with, they could either be in the case of UC Santa Barbara, it could be actually, a state school. But sometimes these also are integrated with networks of what we call privatized charter schools or public-private charter schools. So a charter school is basically a private corporation, but when it gets into a network like a P20 chain, it can get federal or state tax dollars to subsidize its operation. So it's neither public nor private. It's in this weird kind of in-between space. And so UC Santa Barbara has one of those. And there's so many acronyms. All of them.
Right. Well, trying to follow them all in your book, it's pretty tough. There's so many of these groups that are, pretend to be for the children and for education, but what they're really doing is trying to create a monotonous universal type education, right?
Yeah, absolutely, man. My thing is, I didn't plug in my battery, dude. I gotta grab a battery.
All right.
My phone. Give me 10 seconds.
All right, no worries.
Sorry, everybody.
Well, while you're doing that, I'm going to grab the book. So excuse the interruption, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing like live snafus. All right, so at least I'm back. Hopefully John will be here in just a second.
All right, hopefully that wasn't too distracting. Sorry about that.
No worries. So things happen when you're live that are unavoidable. Back in the day, I used to do an edited show for many years, and it took, a week to a month to edit the shows for each episode. And it was, hours, sometimes days and days worth of work editing the videos. And then when you have live, they just go out. So
Yeah. I had the notes ready. I'm like, getting my brain ready, and then all of a sudden I'm going, oh, yeah, it would have been nice to have the plug-in. Okay, yeah.
well, that way your battery doesn't die, right? So all right, let's get back to it. So now, why do you call it in your book? Why do you call it fascism rather than socialism or communism?
Well, there's points in there where I do call it socialism and communism. I guess maybe more the emphasis is on fascism at this point because the current administration is considered it's a Republican, and so
But the
you know
fascists were leftists because, it was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Those were the Nazis, and they were leftist. Socialist is leftist. But that's usually what fascism is
yeah,
compared to. And then they automatically clump that with the right rather than the left.
well, yeah. I mean, and so what I'm kind of getting at is that to me, fascism and communism are kind of two wings of the same bird. In some ways, there are some nuances that you could say are administratively different, but ultimately, it's a merger of corporate and the public sector. It's a merger of government and business.
As
And
as
in
as
some ways, it's
defined
just
as defined by Benito Mussolini, anyway. Correct. But I did see an article recently how fascism came directly out of communism along with socialism.
well, I would say even further back, they both come out of Hegelianism, which is a theme that I kind of try to thread throughout each chapter of the book. And so uh, the idea not only that, for Hegel, he literally said that, the state is God marching on earth. But another principle of Hegelianism was this idea of evolution of ideas, and that those ideas would be manifest in different dispensations of a higher state. And so you could say that the left took it in the direction of communism or socialism, and then you could say the right took it in the direction of fascism or corporatism. Left and right. I think those terms often uh, cloud the debate around what are the issues of these incestuous relationships between government and business. I mean, I'm fine with either label, but in some ways, I think that to refer to it as fascism when the people in charge are Republican makes rhetorically more sense for a larger audience than to try to explain how that is communism. I guess, right? That's one angle, but there are several instances where I very much refer to it as all basically shades of the same color, right? So that's kind of why I would take that angle. Yeah.
And then there's the whole communitarian aspect that I discussed on the show several years ago, and that's a whole other issue that needs a lot more exposing out there. But
I should add this.
the right should
Go for it.
technically be associated with righteousness and correct behavior, not Granted that there are leftists that infiltrate the right and paint the right wrongly, but that's still leftist behavior. Anyway, didn't mean to digress too far there.
No, I want to add too. So what the Democrats are currently pushing, a lot of them in this debate are what's called community schools.
Yeah, you're cutting
But
out a bit
community
there.
schools are
Repeat
pretty
that.
much the same. So if you look at some of the debates, a lot of the Democratic candidates are pushing something called community schools. And it sounds like, and they also frame it as sort of the countervalence to the charter schools, and so they act like it's somebody. I mean, it's got that word community in it, so it suggests maybe more democratic, more public. But if you look at the actual bill, how they define full service community schools in the Every Student Succeeds Act, they are public-private partnerships as well. Pretty much the only difference is they mandate that you have to have social emotional learning, mental health, other health services, and then also, they call it criminal justice stuff. So behavioral interventions for criminal stuff. But again, it's, it's the same thing. It's a slight shift on terminology and how the money is distributed, but it's pretty much the same stuff. Public private.
Let's talk about the uprising of technology in the classroom. Now, I remember when I was in, it must have been, fifth grade. This is probably, I don't know, 1981 or 82. They brought in the first Macintosh computer into the school, into the classroom. And when I was a kid, we were one of the first people in our area to have a TRS-80 computer, and programming the thing all day, and it would record it on a tape deck to play a little video game like paddleball or something like that. How has technology affected the classroom in the last, it's 40 years since then?
So at my level, at the college level, well, at least at the community college, I mean, one of the main things everybody has to do is use what's called a learning management system. So it's basically an online platform where you hook up different modules that the students have to work on. But then sometimes some courses at other colleges might partner with other private software companies with these programs that are called adaptive learning programs. And they basically, they work on the function that it's got some question answer or some problems to solve. And the student, through some sort of response on the keys, gets a score. And then they also give you all these other metrics, right? So they don't just give you the student score for that particular assignment. They give you like average score. They actually give you a classroom view sometimes, right? Like, what's the median and the mean and all that, who's at the higher and lower ends. It's supposed to, I guess, give you some sort of idea about who needs more help and things like that. But those programs are often, they're basically built on the stimulus response method, the psychological method of conditioning. And they come out of what's called the Skinner box or Skinner's box. So that's B.F. Skinner, and he was a psychologist, a behavioral psychologist who came up with operant conditioning.
You're jumping ahead of my notes here. Anyway,
man,
go
sorry.
ahead.
Yeah, so
I sent you those earlier, but yeah, I got B.F. Skinner way down there for about another 30 minutes ahead.
Okay, well, so I won't go too deep into him. All I'll say is this: I'll say that he came up with a thing called the Skinner box,
right?
And it's basically it's a mechanized. He called it a teaching machine, and it was on these little. You ever seen those? You probably remember the ViewMasters. The Disney, so it would have like scenes from the Disney cartoon.
Right.
You put this goggles on, you push this button, and it would.
And this guy tortured his own daughter in those things too, man.
Oh, so they were based on So I didn't want to. I was waiting on that stuff. So it goes. Yeah, those the Skinner box, which is basically analog. It's analog adaptive learning. So it's the adaptive learning software nowadays has screens and basically on a digital window, and then you have input output on a keypad, versus he would have question answer on a tape reel, and you would describe the answer on another window where the tape runs through on a circular gear, and then you would turn this knob analog as you went through it. You couldn't go back, and then it would do the same thing, except it couldn't give you all these other statistics. But that machine that you're referring to, or the Skinner box, that teaching machine was based on the experiments he did with animals, right, and pigeons and things like that. And also, he basically used all those principles to raise his daughter. Basically did use like a box like apparatus.
Has there ever been a follow-up study with his daughter to see how jacked up she was from his abuse?
I'm not super familiar with that. I imagine there probably was, because there was follow-up studies on little Albert. Remember the little Albert experiment with John B. Watson, who is a predecessor to B.F. Skinner. And so, just to pop in a little Brave New World like before.
Well, In
Yeah.
my database, since we're already on Skinner here, in my database, he was tied to the SRI's Changing Images of Man project, which of course was headed by Joseph Campbell and worked on by guys like Julian Huxley, etc. But this was a large part of what came out of the CIA's MKUltra project. B.F. Skinner was also one of the people up at the Esalen Institute, which of course was all MKUltra, founded by Aldous Huxley and Gerald Hurd, and then they put a couple of other people in there to run it. What was the guy's name that was running it? Now I can't. Michael Murphy and the other guy, Dick Price, were in there, and they were. Dick Price was out of the Harvard Social Relations Department, but Tavistock, all these groups in there. These guys were the hardcore socialists running this thing, and it was probably influenced by the New Atlantis, which was focused on creating different levels of communism in the society so that they could run this stuff. And, so B.F. Skinner was tied to all these people. He was tied to Henry A. Murray over at the Harvard Social Relations Department, who, of course, was MKUltra. And that's who Tim Leary, CIA agent Tim Leary, Thomas Chiu, and then there's Dick Price right here. And we can't forget to mention the wonderful Dr. Ted Kaczynski. The Unabomber was also out of that same group of people. Of course, they tortured Ted Kaczynski. And then he later became a professor of mathematics at UC Berkeley, but he wanted to pay him back for the little human experiments they did on him. And so, one thing they don't talk about when you look at these Unabomber studies is he was going after all of these, MKUltra pieces of shit. Yeah, exactly. Wow.
Well, yeah. So I didn't, the Esalen, all that, those connections to Esalen, I actually learned from looking at your stuff. I didn't know about. I never heard of it before you mentioned it, honestly. And I was like, oh, okay. So I looked at that, and then you see all those guys together, and Huxley and Skinner together makes sense because, like I said, chapter 2 is basically they're in what they calls the neo-Pavlovian conditioning rooms. This is all on a spectrum. So B.F. Skinner, he has his operant conditioning, but it's basically just a new name for stuff that goes all the way back to Wilhelm Wundt, right? It goes back to E.L. Thorndike before Skinner. Then there was John B. Watson. He's the guy that also did the little Albert experiment, right? And they took the little boy and they wanted to see could they condition him to be scared of these furry they were bunnies, and at first they would make loud noises and things like that would startle him whenever he was around these bunnies that he actually enjoyed being around. And then eventually anything that looked like a bunny he was scared of, and anything that had white fur he was scared of, and
right.
He never reconditioned that little boy. But in that second chapter, that's basically exactly what they do. They bring the kids out and they put books on down, they put flowers next to them, and then when the babies come out, they're attracted to the books and flowers, and then they set off electric shocks and these loud kaboom sounds, and the kid, it's basically it's an industrial scale little Albert experiment to get the kids scared of learning and scared of nature.
Yeah,
so
I mean these people are just the utmost in psychopathy. It's like Leary used to brag how much he was a psychopath in his works and writings. And there's a conversation between him and Charles Slack where Slack tells him, I'm a psychopath, and Leary tells him, dude, you're not in my league at all. Basically just telling him to sit down and shut up. Like, wait till you're, a psychopath like me, And then Leary and Aldous Huxley were tied into all that stuff. But all of those guys are a nice little clique. And when you go into my database, these guys are all tied together, like Ivan Pavlov tied to B.F. Skinner, Edward Bernays, and then eugenics, population control, Kurt Lewin. Ivan Pavlov's work goes down into MKUltra. So not far to go, and then you can just pick your, the red guys, those are the top evil villains. So you click up here at the top, and You can just go through, like, we got Joseph Campbell, Michael Murphy, all these people that are up at, like Ramdas up at Assailant, who worked with Tim Leary. Of course, he makes his sexual preference sound spiritual by calling it Ramdas, but that's not what it is. And you just go right through the list here of all these guys. And then here's Brzezinski that we have in your book as well. So why don't you talk about Brzezinski for a minute?
So with him, the main importance he has to the book has to do with a book called, I'm probably going to butcher the title, but it's something in the Technotronic era, or America's role in the Technotronic era, I believe, around the 70s. And so Technotronic, and I use that word probably more than I needed to in the book, but just to make that right, to remind readers that that what we have coming here, it's technology and electronics. He's talking about the digital age, the computer age, information technology, and basically how it would merge, like we're talking about, the public and the private sector into this. I guess that was another thing I should have mentioned about that. A better term for that would actually refer to both shades of communism and fascism is actually technocracy. And so basically it's the rule by the efficiency of industrial economic evolution, and through computer technology and information technology. But he actually talked about specifically education. He talked about, didn't call it the Skinner box, but he said that telecommunications referred also to public-private partnerships facilitating it. You'd be able to learn in your house on your little screen, right?
Yeah. Well, sure, when you get right down to it, it starts even before all of this stuff. I mean, as soon as they developed radio, they started working on these things, which is what Dr. Hans Utter and I exposed in the War of the Worlds episode that we put out on Halloween of 2015. But that really lays out the whole foundation of this type of using media to control and manipulate the audience and whatnot. So this, and they develop it and develop it and develop it further along down the line. Somebody was asking in the chat there if you can access the database from the website. It is linked up at the top of the Logos Media website, and you can just go there. And here, I'll just show you. You can just go right here, click on Brain Database, and you can access the database right there. It should load up right here on screen. There it goes. And I would recommend actually clicking the link up here. Full screen online version is right there, but you can access the database there and go through it there. And I recommend spending at least a few days or weeks in there, because there's 10, 15,000 connections in there. There's a lot. There's 12, 13 years worth of research in there. Sorry, John, go ahead.
No, that is a really cool whole map there. It's actually very efficiently laid out. But the computer, the internet, actually, as the Skinner boxes, I mean, we could just jump in there, and not just the Skinner box in terms of the adaptive learning software, like that type of computer where it's designed from the teaching machine, but the actual the way that social media sites and other websites are structured, this is admitted by Facebook, are essentially to get you addicted. And the way they do that is by manipulating your reward center. This is based on the stimulus response method. So I just give you one little, example. This is a good one. So if you're ever on those social media things, I don't do them. The wife likes to do them. Other people scroll them and they'll show me a picture, and sometimes I'll flip through them. And, you scroll down, and if you notice, if you want to center one post, you have to bring up the beginning of the next one, right? And so you're always tantalized with the next post. And I found myself, hey, what's the next one? What's the next one? That's and you kind of get in this gambling thing where it's like, that one wasn't very funny. That one wasn't funny. And then you got a good one, and it's like, hey, let's end on a good note. But no, I want another funny one. And so you go through 3 more bad ones. And this is based on the stimulus response system. So it's
right. So that you have
box.
and it's this idea that you discuss in your book that you have to get the first question or whatever correct before you can go on to the next one, essentially, right?
Yeah, and yes, and then so those are also geared towards basically different what they call career pathways, or if I guess if you're really good, you can get on the academic or the college track. But most people are often put on this what they call the career pathways, and that is based on how you respond. So the algorithm's looking at not just how you the answer you give, but how fast do you provide it, and other types of metrics. Later in the book, it gets into how other types of devices can be attached to this to also keep track of other biometric responses, psychometric responses. So, they can look at your eyes. Are you paying attention to the screen? Are you wandering off and being distracted? Heart rate, things like that. But they don't. Those are not exactly in place. But those they have patents for them, and they do use them for other therapeutic purposes. So I mean, they just have to plug them in. Yeah.
Now, I noticed in your book you bring up the Electronic Freedom Foundation from CIA agent John Perry Barlow. What do you have to say about those guys?
So those guys are only referenced. They charged or they made a suit against Google. I think it's Google Applications for Education. Google, in one of these instances, I was making case studies of ways that, aside from the ways that public-private partnerships can kind of blur the lines between what information can be shared, there's already cases where when schools contract with Google, using just their this GAFE, it's called GAFE, Google Application for Education. It's got some suite. That they take information, they're data mining the students when they do that, and the suit by EFF, the charge is that they're using that data for behavior advertisements, non-educational, right? So in other words, when they do a Google search later, Google's using, I guess, Google AdSense or something to data mine them as a broader consumer outside of education, which would say that that would be a misuse of educational data or educational records. And so I guess the EFF charged them or filed a suit against them in some regard. That's all I referenced them
Did
as.
you know that John Perry Barlow, who founded the EFF, was a member of the Grateful Dead promoting drugs to the youth? The organization was also funded by George Soros.
No.
And Stuart Brand, who of course laid out the whole technological revolution and was a merry prankster, ironically, is who also supported the Electronic Freedom Foundation. But Stuart Brand was behind the electric Kool-Aid acid test. Worked with Timothy Leary, Gregory Bateson, who of course helped found the CIA. But, Myron Stolaroff was another one who was a member of Project MKUltra. But these guys were like right in there. And, it's kind of funny because, I find it ironic that even in your study trying to expose education, that these same evil villains are tied into this stuff. I mean, he's filing the lawsuits through his EFF organization. Meanwhile, he's tied in with guys like Peter Lamborn Wilson, the pedophile who goes by Hakeem Bey. He's tied with Tim Leary. He's tied with the Grateful Dead. He's tied with the Millbrook Mansion. Working under Dick Cheney, etc. So very interesting. But he died like almost 2 years ago. I think right when he started getting exposed publicly as a CIA agent, like that week, he had a heart attack and died.
Yeah, I don't know much. I mean, I didn't know any background to that. I just knew that they're the people that filed the suit, which is interesting though to know that background because Google itself has CIA background.
It's a CIA. It's a CIA front for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Glad you brought that up. People, you can't forget InQtel. In fact, let's see here. Let me see if I can find that here. Yeah, here it is, right here, InQtel. So yeah, it's CIA front, Google, and then of course Google owns YouTube, etc. And where are we broadcasting right now?
Yeah, right. Right. So I mean, but that's a good example too of though sometimes which is a theme in the book, which is the dialectic. I mean, sometimes sometimes a conflict maybe is the conflict is there not because the two sides are actually in conflict, but there's an outcome that both sides want, that they desire by some either social or political third party intervention through the conflict. So I oftentimes try to use a little bit of skepticism when I see conflict, right, or between political conflict, geopolitical conflict, and look at it more. How does the conflict? What does that do? What are the outcomes for the rest of the players involved, as opposed to looking at like this person or this entity versus that? So I don't know. That maybe that's a window for more regulation. I mean, for more of that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks really quick to Mr. Winters for throwing up a super chat there. Please support the show. We can't do it without all your support out in the audience. Also, people can reach out to you and me they can get to me through the Logos Media website, logosmedia.com. How do people reach you by chance, John?
So you can go to the schoolworldorder.info website, and then there's an email there. It's Taoist Professor, but it's spelled with a T, so it's TAOIST Professor @gmail.com. And that's
and we'll give out your info again at the end, but just want to put that out for people who are looking for it. So how are computers being used to control and manipulate our children's education in the classroom?
So we kind of we're starting on, we've touched on it a little bit, and
right.
A lot of that is that, so I can throw out some specific names of the companies or the software, the adaptive learning software. It's called, so some will be Smart Sparrow. There's the Dreambox, Newton, spelled with a KNEWTON. Clever is another one. And so these companies basically are partnering with schools at all grade levels. And at the earlier stages, and some of this is anecdotal just from all the people I know with children, which is that a lot of schools, they have to have the tablets. If you have to have the tablets, that means you have to have, a lot of times that software is on there. Okay. And so those things they pitch them as, they call it individualized or personalized learning, because the idea is that you can learn at your own pace, right? You can take your time with the module. If you're faster than other students, you can move ahead. If you need to take a little more time, you can take a little more time. But the catch is that algorithm is very narrow, and the pathways that it decides for you based on your responses are very narrow. And so it's essentially what I've referred to as, it's a caste system. It's for a caste system, essentially, right? It's to some of these curriculums sometimes there's all sorts of partnerships through some of the channels that we referred to as the P20 or P16 networks, where basically not just there's a private company that is subsidized to provide the software, but also there might be some partnership with a local industry. And so they can pump you into a job with that particular company or that particular industry that is in demand. Sometimes they call them one-stop shops. And some of this also, you get extra federal funds for some of these programs through stuff that's called WIA and WIOA. So one is the Workforce Opportunity and Investment Act, and the other one is, I think, the Workforce Initiative Act. That I might be wrong on my eyes on some of those, but those are federal laws that basically facilitate these types of what they call career pathways. And so so that's kind of where it's at in the classroom now. And interestingly, some of a lot of the Silicon Valley people, they don't send their children to schools where they do a lot of that stuff. There's a school called the Waldorf School where they basically don't use any type of IT or digital computer technology until they're
my sister teaches at a Waldorf school, actually.
Okay. And so yeah, what they do there is they basically abstain from using those stimulus response mechanisms. You should understand too that even if the tablets or the devices that the students are using don't have the adaptive learning software, as we've just mentioned, the internet itself and computer technology itself is largely built to basically interface with that reward mechanism, that stimulus response mechanism. So if a young child has a tablet at an early age, there's studies that show it literally rewires the brain chemistry, the brain structure in different ways, because you're not actually learning you're not thinking in an abstract way, in a formal logic way, or we call logos. You're learning how to interface with the device. You're learning how to get the information through the device, not through your own reasoning, through your own introspection. And so there's so that's the other way that those devices are changing the way young people learn.
Yeah, we should do an episode sometime about how to go to a library and dig through the archives and whatnot and find actual data, and the actual process that we as real researchers would go through to dig something out, like flying to Princeton and going to the Mud or Firestone libraries, or the one of these libraries there at Princeton, and pulling up the actually have them pull out the carts of all of the stuff, and then you sit there all day long flipping through pages of information hoping you find stuff. And that's how we have exposed most of the stuff that we have here, is by pulling these documents out of archives, and most of that stuff is still hidden down there in those archives, and is not in digitized form yet, and they don't want a lot of it digitized. Like, I was sitting there reading Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles' private letters one day about their mom and getting ready for Christmas and whatnot. I'm sure they don't like the CIA doesn't like your average Joe sitting there. And while I was in the Firestone Library at Princeton, they have some agent sitting behind me in a library that's not that easy to get into, just sitting there acting like he's just there to read a newspaper. It's not where you would go just to read a newspaper, but I had an appointment to be there. Nobody else is in the room but this guy who sat there watching me the whole time going through these documents, But
Some of those places like Carnegie, I was gonna, when the eugenics research, I called Carnegie because you can get pretty much all the Rockefeller annual reports online, and they moved them around on the website several times. But the last time I checked, I could still find them. Going all the way back to when it was founded in, I believe it's 1914, I believe is the year. Carnegie Foundation, they only give you like the last 10 years. And then it's like, if you want to, you're like, hey, can you send me? They say, come on down and we'll check you in. And, of course, they want to know who's looking.
Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Right?
Yeah, I get them always. There's the Carnegie Foundation, there's the Carnegie Institute, there's the Carnegie Corporation. There's three of them. One does science, right. One does, I get them mixed up. But yes, that's one of them, yeah.
Carnegie International Endowment for Peace is another one, but the education one, and then the Carnegie Mellon University, Carnegie Libraries, Carnegie Aspen Institute. All these things are running, controlled by the Carnegies, and that's out of the Pilgrim Society, interestingly enough. And Carnegie was worked with John Pierpont Morgan, as did, of course, I think that's the correct Morgan. That could be Senior and not Jack Jr. Jack Jr. actually worked with Gordon Wasson, who was MKUltra Subproject 58. But all of these guys, it's interesting when you go through all of these people, you keep coming back. We were just talking about Waldorf. Rudolf Steiner was another one behind MKUltra and this stuff. He died before then, but it's claimed that Albert Hoffman, who's the so-called discoverer of LSD, which I don't buy for a second. I think it was Arthur Stoll. He was behind the creation of LSD and whatnot, and there's evidence that goes back that he was actually the person who recommended the creation of LSD, and that's a quote by Willis Harriman of the Stanford Research Institute. So all these guys are in cahoots. They're all dirty. They're all, they're all rubbing elbows in the back. It takes us 60, 70 years to flush it out and write a book about it. They're so far ahead of us on this stuff. By the time we figure it out, they're already dead by the time we figure out what they did,
Yeah, the funny thing, when I first learned about Esalen Institute, for me, all these where this nexus, one of these places where this nexus is, I Google this up and I look at, just kind of flip through their website, and they had a conference coming up. I think it was April last year. It was called Hacking the Mind, Hacking something to. It had Stanford people. It was about brain-computer interfaces. It's like, okay, so there you go, the cherry on top, right? That's the cherry on top.
And you're like, okay, Jan's right. All right,
I always think it was interesting. Huxley never mentioned any of that stuff in the novel, but. Funny thing is, you talk about these guys all getting together. I had this rare book. It's called High Priest, and it's got Larry and it's got Huxley and who's the guy that did Howl?
That's that sick pedophile. What's his name?
Ginsburg.
Yeah, Allen Ginsburg. Yeah, that sick pedophile. Then, that's the one.
And I think Ram Dass is in there, and but there's it's weird the way it's laid out, but long story short is that there's a little vignette in there where Huxley and Leary it's a little dialogue between them, and for whatever reason, overpopulation comes up from Aldous Huxley in a conversation about it's largely focuses on psychedelics and the I Ching and the Tibetan Book of the Dead and all that type of esoteric stuff, but he gets into this, he goes on this tangent about overpopulation in the middle of it. It tells you something about what else goes on in these circles, right? It's not just whatever they're publicizing. Right.
Well, and let me see. Let me just look up neologisms here really quickly, because it seems like, most of these neologisms are developed by the Huxley family or their friends, and it seems like there was one regarding technocracy or something like that. Julian Huxley is who coined transhumanism. Here's Julian right here. But he actually coined the term transhumanism. And so, speaking of technocracies, so, we have, it's like he's behind the eugenics movement. He's, get this, their grandfather coined the word agnostic, and you start following this stuff through. And you start seeing he also coined the term Darwinism. But you see all these neologisms that are popular today came out of the Huxley family. Like Aldous Huxley coined the term the pill that women all like to use today.
Okay. Well, I often say that Darwinism should be called Huxleyanism, because Darwin was also a shy person. He didn't want to be the spokesman. He didn't want to go to lectures, and so Huxley was called Darwin's bulldog because he liked doing.
Well, yeah, he was Darwin's propaganda manager. You're spot on about that. And then what Thomas Henry Huxley did was he created a group called the X Club, which consisted of Edward Franklin, George Busk, Herbert Spencer, John Lubbock, John Tyndall, Joseph Hooker, Thomas Archer Hurst, William Spottiswoode, and these guys were all placed in specific universities to propagate and propagandize this horse shit that we call Darwinism today. That was all put out there by this guy, Thomas Henry Huxley, but all of these MK Ultra people and the eugenicists, et cetera, all center around the Huxley family. I've never researched anything on any of this stuff that wasn't in one way or another connected to one of the Huxley family members. You know, lots of people who watch the show, they would play the drinking game whenever we mentioned the name Huxley. They would take a drink. So, I mean, if there's any listening tonight, they're getting freaking wasted.
Well, yeah, the book that he coined the term transhumanism in is called "New Bottles for New Wine," which is actually a spin on a Christian verse. I can't know. It's the New Testament. I don't know which one off the top of my head, but it's the idea of being reborn, right? And so you don't put basically. I'm going to paraphrase, but in the New Testament, it's something to the effect of you don't put old or new wine in an old skin, because I guess what it would do is it would inflate and it would, it wouldn't. The skin would somehow decay or it would pop or something. So he had to have a new skin for new wine, and so he's basically inverting, right? This Christian.
Well, that's what Huxleys do, is invert. That's really their only intellectual move, apparently. Who created the term tinfoil hat?
I don't know that one, actually.
Oh, dude. I actually found this in the Firestone Library at Princeton. So let's pull that up. And that was, let me just see here, go back to neologisms. Boy, I got far from that page. So here's tinfoil hat. That was coined by Sir Julian Huxley in an article called The Tissue Culture King that I found at Princeton, and there is the quote right there.
What year?
I didn't write down the year when I was there. Let me see if here it is. I'll just show the whole article on screen here. Come on. Here it is. All right. So, but it's this short article, Tissue Culture King. I don't see a date on it.
I was just curious because how long have they been using the term? I'm curious how long they've been using it.
Well, since Huxley's time, I mean, you can't think without using a Huxleyan neologism.
Yeah, I mean the whole I guess hippies or counterculture, a lot of it anyways. A lot of that comes out of the Huxley, right. A lot of the science fiction writers of a lot of them.
See, the psychedelic revolution, you can't give the name the psychedelic revolution to a Huxley, because that was actually Humphrey Osmond, Huxley's personal doctor. So
yeah, I didn't get into like pharmaceuticals or drugs, or as far as the influence, because there's a lot you could just off the top of my head with ADHD medicines and things like that. But what I did go on, I didn't go into the pharmacotropic aspect of it, but they are actually coming up with. I'm jumping ahead in the book. Yeah, you probably didn't get to this yet, which is
this will be for our next show. But anyway, you're gonna give a little.
Yeah, they have computers that basically are prescriptions for your ADHD. And so it's through biofeedback technology. One of them is actually run by a company called NeuroCore, and it's funded by Betsy DeVos and her husband. She was on the board of the company all the way up until she became the Secretary of Education. Then she said, I stepped down from the board, but did not divest her shares. This company, one of the things it does is so I guess to treat ADHD, you sit down in front of this thing, and you're supposed to pay a certain amount of attention, and it tracks it with EEG and other biofeedback. They call it galvanic skin response. So it has to do with your electrical conductivity in your skin, things like that. But basically, it's looking at your brain waves, and when your brain waves give off a signal that indicates that you're not paying attention, the screen, whatever game that you're playing or whatever video is on there, halts, and then so you have to make some adjustment to get the screen going again. I guess it's supposed to rewire at some subconscious level your autonomic system to be more focused and more attentive. That's one company, but there's others. One's called Akili, AKILI. You got off it's a game-based learning prescription. So that's another way that technology.
Yeah, and never mind that the ADHD is probably diet and nutrition related, and having all of this technological garbage in the first place. So
Oh
now
yeah, no, I mean
now they're
for
going to
sure.
use the cause for the cure, right?
And that's what I mean by like I didn't get into like that aspect of it, but you're absolutely right. I mean, um, you know, I'll just anecdotally, I remember when I used to compete new martial arts competitions, you have to get a blood test. It would always give you a depression questionnaire for no reason. And it was always odd to me because they'd ask these questions like, "Are you?" I'm like, "No, I'm ready to go. I'm feeling great." And then it was like, "Why are you asking me these questions?" Well, if you check yes on any of those, they're gonna offer you some pharmacotropics, or they're gonna offer you a prescription for something. And so I know I have other anecdotal, stories I could tell about people that said, the first thing they're offered is a prescription. It's not, hey, how much are you sleeping? Do you exercise? Do you get off the couch at all? Like, are you things like that? It really do. It's not just the endorphin that you get from actually sweating and stuff, but you feel accomplished. I'm getting off topic from education, but you're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
All right, so we went way off the
Yeah.
outline, but yeah, we'll have to get into some of that next time I have you back. So, teaching for corporations jobs rather than thinking. I guess we kind of already covered that last show a bit. You want to go into that anymore?
So, I guess we kind of touched on some of it today as well. All right. We talked about what's called the career pathways. I guess maybe I could say that, it's important to mention this because I don't go deep into. I mentioned a couple times I use the term community schooling, right? But I largely refer to charter schooling as the current mode of school privatization that facilitates these public-private partnerships that basically funnel the students into jobs as opposed to a higher mind. Okay. Um, I went in one direction and then I lost my train of thought there. Sorry about that. Where was I? What was I saying for?
You need more butter and fat in your diet. You had a brain
Oh,
fart.
that might be what it is. I do that at about an hour in here. I do. My brain starts to get foggy. I might lose train of thought. No, I remember
whenever I need, have a brain failure, I just drink some more butter.
You're on the keto stuff. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So what I meant to say is that the book focuses on charter schooling as the main mode of privatization, but and those would be called career pathways curriculums. But in the community schooling package, they'll call it pipeline services. Okay. But these are the same things. It's basically a school is partnered with particular companies. It usually has to do, with the whatever's the industry that is, the big one in the local area, and they'll facilitate through what's called a one-stop shop. Okay. So but yeah, we covered a lot on workforce training. I guess we could talk about how the stimulus response method is built into that. Some of the terms they use are called outcomes-based education or competency-based education. Okay, so if you're training the students for a career pathway for a charter school or a pipeline service for a community school, which are the same things, they're just right-wing terms and left-wing terms. Basically, what you'll do is I lost my train of thought again when I did that.
Dude, Brondo, I swear, it's got electrolytes.
Yeah. It has to do with filling the quotas either way. And so that means that you only need competency for a particular outcome. That's what it was. When I split my brain into the charter, into the community schools, I had two threads. But either way, both of those use a philosophy called competency-based education or outcomes-based education. These are spins on the same term. It means that there's a predetermined outcome. The outcome has to do with filling a particular quota that's predetermined by a public-private partnership with a company and the government, whether you call it a pipeline or a charter school. Okay, and that's
it's not to create a bunch of critical thinkers who use the trivium and can master their own education, become polymaths and autodidacts and whatnot. They want people who need to be told what to think and what to believe. I remember when I first. I worked in IT for years. I was a network engineer, ran a company network and stuff for a while. But I remember when I was in IT school one day, it all hit me what logic really was, and it just like gong. And, it's like nobody had ever taught me. I just figured it out sitting there in class one day. And, I'll never forget when I figured it out. And then maybe it was probably 6 years after that when I got the trivium. And then it all really started clicking together. But, they're not going to give you that level of teaching. There was a newspaper article that came out of Texas maybe 8-9 years ago that said that they didn't want to teach kids logic because they didn't want kids questioning the adults, And that's not the right attitude. I mean, nobody grows if nobody's questioning and learning. And if an adult can't admit that they're wrong about something when a child questions them, if they are in fact wrong, then nobody learns from that. It's a lost opportunity. But, all right, so I wanted to mention the final revolution. Let me see if I can find it in my article. I think it's in Spies in Academic Clothing. So let's see here.
Is this the Huxley interview?
It's a quote.
Lecture?
It's a final. No, I don't know. It's in one of my papers, The Final Revolution.
Okay.
But, Huxley was talking about how he wanted to mind control the world and how this was the final revolution, what they were doing. And, boy, where is that? It's got to be in one of my articles. See, I can't remember what's in my own stuff anymore. You get that after you write something, you can't remember what you wrote?
Oh, no, yeah. I mean, I have more sympathy for, like, when I look at the students and they got the 2 or 3 page paper, I'm like, don't you know that? But now, when I write big stuff like the book that I'm like, when you mentioned GAIF, the Google, I said, I gotta look at that. I don't remember EFF. I remember it, but I don't remember it, right?
Right.
You got a vague sense of it.
All right. So anyway, the final revolution was Huxley's idea where that they were going to use barbiturates and whatnot. It may have been his conversation with George Orwell, Eric Blair, about their final dumbing down of the population so that they couldn't fight back anymore. And they were, them and the Fabian Society, they were all Fabian socialists. But this was what they really wanted, was to give the government the ultimate control. This is what the psychedelic revolution and all that was about, was to create this total system of control for the government and for these elites and psychopaths like Aldous Huxley and whatnot, who, using their own their self-appealing advaracunium fallacy, put themselves as the grand masters of the whole scheme. But so this final revolution was the final battle where everybody was under their control. The alphas, betas, deltas, epsilons of the Brave New World, etc. So, it's gone from using the drugs essentially to using this technocracy, this outcomes-based education to achieve this and to lead the kids along, not to grow them intellectually, but to give them enough education and thinking to be able to do their job or to program and whatever. I don't know. It's probably not even C++ anymore. I don't want to sound that outdated, but whatever they're using these days, to be able to handle this type of work and nothing more. They don't want people that it can go out and beyond that.
Yeah. So in Brave New World, that final revolution, one of the things they talk about, or the world controller mentions, is he says that basically good ruling is done from the buttocks. What that means is you're sitting down and you don't have to intervene with any sort of force, right? And how do you do that? Well, it's basically by making the subjugated population incapable of free thought. And so,
yeah, they would no longer need to use any force because people were so dumbed down that they didn't need any force to do it anymore. Whereas the trivium, on the other hand, created everybody who was intellectually competent. It would be like giving everyone a firearm. Everybody's equal. Everybody has the trivium. They're all equal. It's like they say, Samuel Colt was the great liberator of men. God created all men. Samuel Colt made them equal. And so, the trivium gives everybody, and the quadrivium gives everybody an equal intellectual footing. And the, being able to defend yourself gives you that same defense on the physical plane. So you have to master your physical and intellectual. If you're just if you only learn jujitsu but you don't learn the trivium, the mental jujitsu, how do you defend yourself? That's where I was going at with that.
Yeah. So well, yes. There's a part in Brave New World where Linda, it's what they call him the Savage. He's the Savage. He comes from the reservation. His mother was actually from the world state where they're all genetically engineered, and she's trying to tell him stories about how that place was. And she worked in this chemical factory. He says, "Where did the chemicals come from?" Right? And she says, "I don't know. They probably came from another factory." Right? And so basically, what that's an illustration of is kind of what we're talking about. That's competency-based education. You know just enough to be able to perform your function in the economic chain, right? To basically get the product either developed or delivered in whatever stage it's at in that chain. And interestingly, it was the world controller at the end who says that the reason why he was chosen to be the world controller was because he was doing illicit science, basically. And then the people he has there who are in trouble, it's Helmholtz, Watson, and Savage. They basically say, what do you mean by that? You tell us that science is everything. How can it be illicit? That's basically our religion. He doesn't quite say that, but that's what he says. And he says, well, no, you all just have a cookbook. I was actually doing real science. I was practicing the scientific method. I was thinking of my own formulas. I was thinking outside of whatever equations I was given in my cookbook. Whatever recipes I was given in my cookbook. So that's competence. That's the difference, right? This person, and he actually has, when they were talking to him, they find that he's in this this private, I guess we call it an ivory tower or something, and it's got Shakespeare and the Bible, and he can read all the stuff he wants to read. He can think how he wants to think about it. And so that's basically what we would call your classical education. And that involves when everybody has that, when everybody learns that, it's also called civics, right? And that's not what we do. That's obviously not part of an adaptive learning software. I mean, maybe there might be some historical factoids that they want you to memorize predetermined, but as far as reading the Federalist Papers and understanding, right, what are the logical reasons for why we have the frame of government that we have, right, and being able to participate in it, that is not competency-based education either, right?
Talk about the eventual goal of removing teachers from education, from the classroom, and just having this computer teacher AI intelligence teach our kids.
So you're almost halfway there, because the times that I've had to use some of the adaptive learning software, the students know, I think everybody does this, no matter how committed or how you perform as a student. Got a lot of stuff. Sometimes you figure out where are the most points at and focus on those, right? Because you're very concerned about your grade. Maybe sometimes in the institutional setting, more than learning the information or the concept. Okay. So in that instance, I need to stop taking tangents like that, because I lost my I lost my
I think we were talking about ADHD earlier, and you just left back there, and
I think I used to say that I was supposed to have that one. Maybe there was something right about that. I get two trains of thought going there.
Right. Up your butter intake. Then you can go like 60, 70 thoughts and still manage to pull it back.
The other thing is that we're at
it's actually Brondo, I swear, Brondo.
It's 12 hours into my day, man. I teach at the two schools, and I'm zipping and zapping, and by this time I get serious brain fog. But yeah, what was the AI replacing the teachers? Okay, so when you're using the adaptive learning software, the students are focused on their grades, and so what that means is that when they require that software to be a certain percentage of the course grade, what they do is the students are trying to get on the computers and finish those modules while you're trying to give them the lessons about how to actually do the modules. And so you're basically competing with the computers, right? You're basically competing with them already. So they've got them. They call that a blended learning scenario. And so the class is basically half online or half computer, and it's half brick and mortar, face-to-face lecture, paper
Right.
pencil stuff. Okay, so you're already halfway there. Now on my end, it's supposedly supposed to help me out because I can see these individual metrics for each student, and I can also see the group metrics, and somehow that's supposed to help me to give some personalized or individualized instruction. I mean, you can usually anecdotally see this stuff without looking at these little pie charts and bar graphs that they give you. So that's how it's supposed to help you, but we keep going down that path. What they also have is they have some of these automated services, usually at colleges, maybe at some nicer high schools, where it's basically a tutoring bot. It kind of functions like some of those, voice automated services, customer services you'd use on for any given company. And so
Terrible.
kind of go down that path, and then you got to understand that these machines are data mining the whole time.
Right.
So they're learning how to be more efficient the more you use them. So they're learning from you. You're teaching them as much as they're teaching you. And eventually, if you look at that trajectory kind of from a bird's eye view, you have to think, well, what is really the end game? Is it really that these things are making it more efficient for us to learn and have classical logos and think like the trillium, or is it that we're teaching the machines, we're programming them every time that we use them, and every time they're doing something that's helping us, making it easier, more efficient, what they're really doing is, it's like a digital lobotomy. They're carving out parts of your own mind.
That's well said. That's what your book should have been called, Digital Lobotomy.
Well, if you look at some of, who's the guy? Delgado, Jose Manuel.
Oh, yeah. That guy was a freaking psychopath. Wow. Talk about MK Ultra freak show. Wow.
Yeah, and that's literally what it was. A lot of what he had in there was for people that, I guess had, sometimes temperamental disorders or things. And so he said, they were very violent. And this thing was essentially, he said it was better than the lobotomy because it left the brain intact. It didn't scramble them up with the rod or whatever they would stick in there. And so, so that's the end game. So once the computers, you have to also think, listen, if a computer can teach a human being better than another human being, that means it can think better than another human being. If it can think better than another human being, what are you good for? That's what the brain chip is for, right? Because you need it to be able to actually be worth something. You have to interface with it. And then you ask the question, why would you do something? Why would you build these computers that look like they're going to replace people? Well, it's either, Musk will say, I'm coming up with Neuralink as the savior to help prevent AI. Why don't you just not build AI? Both goals are what they want, is how I read it. It's tautological. It's the third law of formal logic, right? It can't be, it's one or the other. It's not both and neither. So if you really were scared of it, you wouldn't build it. And so if you're going to build it, then that means that the chip is not to save you. It means that the chip, both of those are for the same end goal, and they always have been. That's how I read it. Maybe I misinterpret it, but that's how I infer it.
Now, I spoke to a teacher earlier today about your book. Just give you a heads up here. And giving her the gist of it, and her response was, I don't think teachers will become obsolete because learning is a social process.
So this is where we're talking semantics and word games. So now what is a social process? That could be basic. No, you have to think like this. You really do. You have to think like a deconstructionist. You have to, instead of thinking the word means what it means in its grammar, you have to say, what are the other contexts and so think about it like this. If a community school...
Well, her argument was that it couldn't be because she's worked in a classroom for 15 years. That was her argument.
Well, I've been in one for 10 years. I'm at the college level. What do I don't see what's in the high school and the middle school level. I read a lot about it, and I know what the KIPP structure is. Some of this, right, you have to actually look out. You have to look at it from a bird's eye view. If you only paid attention to what you're doing in your classroom, that's a very narrow box. Now, if you
that's myopic, right?
If you only pay attention to what's happening in your department, that's still very narrow. If you only paid attention to your college, it keeps going all the way up to, to the international level. It really does. And, we talked about stuff like Carnegie, Ford Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates is on the outline. These are all, we go back to Rockefeller Foundation. This is where the agenda is set. It goes down through these public-private partnerships, and then it goes to the dean or the trustees, then to the dean, then to your department, then to you. And so it also happens on an incremental basis. So, probably I imagine this particular teacher probably hasn't heard of a lot of the biofeedback technologies, the tutoring, the tutor bots. There's in Japan, it's not Sophia. That's the one that's made by Ben Goertzel. I can't think of it. There's an actual robot in Japan. It's in the book. It looks like a humanoid, and it stands in front and gives lessons. I mean, so in Korea and Japan, they actually have like not just bots, like AI. Maybe we should say is of two types. They call it dumb AI and then smart AI or general AI. So the dumb AI is basically just your basic algorithm on an adaptive learning software, but your general AI, which they don't quite have yet, would be something more that has cognitive abilities to reason like a person. But they do have something that's kind of in between. So it looks like a human, and it can do really sophisticated stimulus response algorithms. So like, nobody has that in the US, but they have these things. So the other thing about a social process is that, when you start talking about redefining the human body, that you blur the lines between biology and technology. I mean, social can be, transhumanists talk about, instead of human rights, they refer to this term, they call it personhood. You have people in bioethics, lawyers, talking about how are we going to redefine civil rights in terms of not just human rights, but personhood rights when we start having bots and machines that can basically reason the way that we can. And so
right,
at that point, what is the social process?
Right, and they're already trying to add these things to human rights, giving them driver's licenses, all this kind of stuff,
And that's so, and so, right. And when you can even hear some of that language. Look at some of the, there's a charter, a UNESCO charter, United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization, UNESCO.
Founded by Julian Huxley. Sorry, folks. I know you're getting hammered.
Yeah, founded by him. And in it, you can look, if anybody wants to read that one, you can get the PDF online for free. All right. It's 1946 or 47. But in there, he talks about eugenics. He also talks about overpopulation. This is the guy that later founds the World Wildlife Fund. But in the UNESCO charter, this is a newer charter. I don't know, a few years tops. Okay, it's in the book. It basically talks about human rights, but it talks about it, in terms of, having access to technology. It also has another charter where it mentions transhumanism. Put the two together and think about what do you get, right? So human rights means everybody should be plugged into something, because that's the next stage in evolution. So why, if you don't plug in, if you didn't give everybody access, that would be discrimination. You'd be mean to somebody to let them, if you let them be a natural human being or a biological or whatever the archaic term is for that. So that's my retort for what we mean by social.
Well, you kind of touched on Davos. You want to go into Jeb Bush and his role in all of this crap?
Yeah, I believe their connection is he's funded a lot of charter schools. Now, again, there's so many acronyms. This is probably in the American Foundation.
Michael Connor just said technological egalitarianism. There you go.
Yeah, there you go. All right.
Thanks, Michael. You just coined a new term, unless you got it somewhere else. Good job, buddy.
Yeah, well, then Jeb Bush is another one that talks about having access to online technologies and online charter schools is, basically the next wave of the future. And America, there's too many. The acronyms escape me, but he funds some private, some nonprofit foundations that basically fund charter schools, uh, and and some of those institutions are the ones that Betsy DeVos has also put money into, and also they have given speeches at some of the same conferences where they push the same education stuff. That's Bush's main connection, or Jeb's anyway. Yeah.
All right, you already hit UNESCO. That was on my list. We already did B.F. Skinner. Charter schools, removal of the teacher, final revolution, stimulus response methods of education. You want to hit that? Or I think you did a little bit at the beginning. Do you want to go into that anymore?
Man, I could do a little history. I mean, I could plug in some. We threw some names out that I could unpack a little
All
bit. I
right,
mean,
because
so
we're gonna have to do a part 3 of this after the new year, I think.
yeah, that's cool, man. That'll be fun. Very cool. So stimulus response is the original term I would use for what we might otherwise call classical conditioning. A good book, if you want to read a good book on how this method of psychology became a method of education or a philosophy of education, also pedagogy. The book is called the Leipzig Connection, I believe.
I have it, yeah.
It's a little teeny thing. You can read it.
Yeah, little
yeah.
white book. Yeah, I've got it.
And it's a lot of block quotes from some of these people in their own words. And so it starts with basically Wilhelm Wundt and how he, basically he came up with the first
Bernard
psychology.
Shaw.
Sorry?
Bernard Shaw.
What about George Bernard Shaw?
Isn't okay? Maybe I'm reading something here. I think I was just trying to remember the name of the author of that book.
Oh no, that's Paulo Leone.
Okay.
And then there's some has only Leone and the other one has a second author on it, which is weird to me. I don't know why that is.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead. Didn't mean.
No, it's okay. Yeah. So Wundt basically came up with the first. He made psychology a science. He came up with the first laboratory for psychological experimentation. So he came up with the laboratory method. Before that, psychology was essentially a subdiscipline of philosophy. Okay. And what he did was, psychology actually means the study of the soul, right, or the spirit. And basically, for Wundt, kind of said that's never going to happen. You're not going to get in there and grab an ounce or an inch of soul or spirit, but you could basically study its impacts or effects essentially through what we'd call now the nervous system, right, through your behavioral responses to stimuli. So you kind of essentially every behaviorist psychologist comes out of this school. It's about 600 PhDs, I believe, that come to 400 and 600. There's a chart in the back for the book on that. And it came to America to basically spread this type of psychology. Okay, and basically it's what Pavlov's dog is a good illustration, right? You can you can condition the human mind to exhibit particular behaviors in response to particular stimuli by associating them with the rewards or the punishments and playing on that reward and punishment mechanism, right? And so the whole thing with Pavlov's dog, right? He's hungry. If you show him food, he salivates. If you ring the bell every time you give him the food, he salivates. You remove the food, you ring the bell, he salivates. Now he has this basically reward response to the bell. That's the stimulus response method, otherwise called classical conditioning. Later on, it gets brought over here by G. Stanley Hall. And G. Stanley Hall, who was also very much a Hegelian, in the Hegelian philosophy, he passes that down to John Dewey. And John Dewey is one of the most important figures in American education. Columbia University, University of Chicago. And he really sets the new method of education, which is a mixture of Hegelianism and stimulus response stuff. Under him comes out John B. Watson, who we mentioned earlier, right? The guy that did the Little Albert experiment. He's referenced in Brave New World as a character. It's Helmholtz Watson. And then there's others that come out of this same lineage, and that one would be E.L. Thorndike. And he's the one that really kind of popularizes, or I guess solidifies the whole the skinny. He's kind of where Skinner got the Skinner box idea from, right? He's the one that put the rats in the mazes and things like that, and tried to figure out cognition. He's also very much into education, right? These people are all right. They're not just psychologists; they're also education philosophers or pedagogues, right? And always thought it was weird when I was learning, getting my teaching certificates. I had to learn educational psychology because I just thought it was weird because it's like, how does I'm not trying to tweak this person's brain. Like having a map of the cognition doesn't necessarily help me master my content and understand when I'm delivering it in an articulate manner that has clear steps that people can follow.
You mean
right?
like who, what, where, when, then why, then how?
I don't need to know everybody's different types of stimulus, their different proclivities at the neurochemical level to be able to, deliver a good curriculum in a way that makes sense, right? But after I learned about the history of educational psychology, it's like, oh, okay, I get it. Now I understand why we have to learn this, because this is education is psychology. I mean, the two kind of basically go. If you study it, if you have a degree in it, you're basically getting a degree in psychology. And nowadays, you're actually getting a little bit of a degree in some business practices too. Because if you have an EDD, you're usually going to be an administrator. And that means you also have to know how to, facilitate the grants and the public-private partnerships. You just, right? But so basically, E.L. Thorndike, he passes the torch off to B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner, he calls it for Watson. They change the names as you go. So, I watch my students. I also tutor, and I tutor all different disciplines. So I get students in psych, and they're always confused about what's the difference between stimulus, the classical, the behaviorist, the operant. It's not a whole lot different. I mean, like I try to tell them, think of them all as pretty much the same thing with different quadrants. That's pretty much the same idea, but it's all based on bypassing the logos of the mind and getting to the pathos of the body or the nervous system to get to elicit a particular response. And it plugs into what we talked about as far as career pathways to fill a quota for a caste system and a technocracy. That's pretty much the whole. That would be a good, I think, lineage of stimulus response psychology. And then now just at this point, I guess I could add one more thing is that after Skinner, the lineage is no longer people, it's different types of software. Skinner passes the torch to the Skinner box. The Skinner box then goes on its own evolution, which is what Ray Kurzweil would call it. And basically it goes from an adaptive learning software that's on a screen to a biofeedback wearable that's either a headband or a bracelet that looks at your biometrics, and then eventually to a brain chip that interfaces with the AI, and then you're now a new creature, or the new man, is Huxley would like to call it.
Well put. Yep. And we don't see anybody wearing those watches and all yet, thank goodness.
You have to, and that's, I sound cynical or conspiratorial.
Do you remember when a phone was for calling people and a watch was for telling time?
They got Bose headphones. I saw an ad for Bose headphones. The ad is like this. Everybody's walking around looking at the phone, except the one dude that's got the Bose headphones on. He doesn't have to be blind to his phone because now he's got it on. It's got an Alexa plugged into it. I'm sorry, I should say it. The Alexa is programmed into his Bose headphones, so he can hear his music, whatever he's doing on his phone. They can read it to him, etc.
Yeah, and then Siri is Stanford Research Institute, which is CIA, and blah blah blah. It's like, come on, people! It's MK Ultra 3.0 here we're dealing with.
I mean, it's on. I used to look at it like kind of like you look at it from afar, and you're like, if you kind of look at the trajectory, if it keeps going, and you feel like, well, maybe it might take a different turn as you go, but then you see the next step, and you see the next step that's what they are. They're getting you comfortable to having this stuff on your body, and then eventually it'll
tiptoe totalitarianism. Yep, that's right.
Now, don't forget, look, another company that wants to make the brain-computer interface is Facebook.
Yeah.
What's Facebook's main their main line of getting revenue. It's data mining. It's data mining your stuff. You think that it's not going to data mine whatever's going on biochemically, neurobiologically?
And well, they get a lot of money from the DNC too, to not, to suppress anything that has to do with conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is a lot of censorship going on. I've seen it even on the left as well. I mean, but yeah, it's definitely anything that's not status quo for sure.
Yeah,
For sure.
yeah, I'll give you that.
Yeah.
So, what else you want to add before we wrap it up?
I think that's pretty good. Yeah, I guess those are pretty good ones. There's a couple other topics, but we can wait for those.
All right. Well, okay. So next Tuesday is Christmas Eve. I probably will not do a show, and we were going to have Steve back soon from the perennial discussion. Steve Jones from Philosophia Perennis. So we need to get him on. I can't remember if he said after Christmas or after New Year. I'll have to go back and check or message him. That would probably help. But and then so we can have you back, either after Christmas or after New Year, however it plays out. Well, I'll follow up with you on that. Get that scheduled with you. And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for supporting the show and donating. You can donate directly to contact@logosmedia.com. Or you can, from PayPal, you can also click on the Patreon link and go there, or donate via Bitcoin. Also, go to logosmedia.com and you can support the show there. Much needed support. And, John, where can people get your book, The School World Order?
So you can go to trineday.com. You can get it straight from the publisher. Otherwise, it's on Amazon and it's on, all the other distributors as well. But you can get it straight from the publisher at Trine Day. You can get it from my website at schoolworldorder.info. And then, my contact information is on there as well. So those are all ways.
Cool. You want to give out your email address one more time?
So it's Taoist Professor, and it's Tao with a T. So it's TAOIST professor@gmail.com.
All right, that's a good place to wrap it up for tonight, and we'll have you back here soon as we plug through your book and all of this stuff. Can't wait to get into the AI and more Julian Huxley crap. Why is all of this stuff always associated with Huxley? At what point, just one last question, at what point in your research did you start going, Huxley?
That's the beginning. That's what actually kind of got me down the because I was given the novel by one of the people that taught me a lot of my martial arts, and I read it, and then I kind of started hearing things about that I mentioned last time, that I was a late learner about eugenics, and then I was like, wait a minute, and then I started looking at the history of the author and his brother, and then it's just like you said, it's like it's a rabbit hole you can't get out of.
Man, dude, that family, they destroyed a generation or two or three, and real quick, Aldous Huxley used to live on the next mountain ridge over here, and in Wrightwood, and, if there was one person ever that should have been stopped, it's that guy, It's like, man, they have things to take care of people like that.
People always, when I mention that book, they're always like, I thought the book was against all that. And it's the hardest conversation because you have to give them all of this history. And they're just like, what are you talking about?
And then you look like you're crazy because you got to give took me like 8-9 years to lay out all this stuff about the damn Huxley family, and it's like, yeah, man, that guy is the Huxleys, probably the biggest psychopaths, the most detrimental family to the history of humanity ever. I can't, you could say Aleister Crowley or Hassani Sabah or Dr. John Dee or, some of these characters, but, and they're all in there. Tim Leary, they're all in there. But then you have Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley is what the 500 Smith & Wesson should have been invented for.
Well, interesting factoid. We'll probably end with this one. Is that he died? I think we talked about this before. He died on the exact same day and same year as John F. Kennedy and also C.S. Lewis.
Did you see in my article, Spies in Academic Clothing, how the whole death thing is a fraud and all of that? And I could write a whole paper just on the connection between JFK's assassination and Aldous Huxley's so-called death. Of course, Laura Huxley dosed Aldous Huxley with a ton of drugs, and then Sidney Cohen, she's consulting Sidney Cohen for this supposedly, and then the whole thing is a death cult. The psychedelics have always been used in death cults. Magic mushrooms were the Aztec death cult, but so this became the foundation of using psychedelics to aid in death. And of course, it's all based on nonsense and Laura Huxley's hearsay, but that is the whole foundation of it. But she contacts Sidney Cohen, another CIA MKUltra doctor, and he's like, oh, yeah, just shoot him up with a bunch of heroin and LSD and, stick a whole bunch of crap, dirt, who knows, whatever else she stuck in the syringe and shot him up with it. And at least that's what's claimed, and then it was lights out for him. But he had recruited Tim Leary to the CIA's MKUltra program the day that JFK was elected.
Oh, that I didn't know. Now that's odd. Now that's really odd.
Right,
really
right. Oh, it's just coincidence for all the coincidence theorists out there. It's just coincidence because we don't want to put on a Julian Huxley tinfoil hat or something. So
well, yeah. And I learned about that way that he got that dose, on his deathbed from your research. And you learn the day, and you got to assume on the same day that this other person is set. It's just that certainly is a very, very big coincidence.
Right. Well, he was his arch nemesis, so I think it was like, my nemesis is dead. But like I said, if there was any purpose that the 500 Smith & Wesson should have been invented for, it should have been invented for Aldous Huxley. Just atomize that fucker. Anyway, I'll leave it there, folks. Merry Christmas, happy holidays. There's a little, freedom of consciousness for you to hit the holidays. It's good politically correct stuff to bring up over the Christmas family dinner.
Hey, man, everybody's wearing them. You're using the devices, Hey,
yeah, there you go.
Common topic. Yeah.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks for tuning in tonight. See you after the holidays. If I decide to do a show next week, you'll all be there, but you'll all probably be having your Christmas dinners or whatever. So we'll see, and good night. See you then, and see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.